Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant. We hope you're having a nice weekend, and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers. A little later, a discussion on race relations in Kentucky, why it is very timely to assess where we are now and where we may be going forward, living in harmony. Bill Goodman and Gerald Smith on some frank issues. That's a little later. But first, Kentucky House Majority Leader Jonathan Schell is here as the state is facing up to a huge pension problem, and they're trying to figure out somehow to keep state government running under that burden. Schell is a young but calm voice who is urging lawmakers to analyze where things stand before figuring out how to move forward. We'll ask him about some proposals to control costs. Some say that we hold too many prisoners in the state, for one thing. Some are pointing out that we spend too much to make license plates. Is that kind of thing enough to make up for an already projected shortfall and whatever is going to have to be done to shore up those pensions? House Majority Leader Schell joining us today. He is a Republican who represents Gerald, part of Madison, and Rockcastle counties. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you, Bill.
You've seen this report, as at this point we all have, on what is recommended for the state and where the pension problems are in Kentucky. How do you describe them?
You know, I'd just like to make sure that the viewers understand that the PFM report that came out was commissioned in the 2016 budget that we actually, I think it was the 2016 budget that we put forward. In that budget, we allotted for, under House Democrat leadership and Senate Republican leadership, a bipartisan budget, around $3 million for that study to be performed. So far, that study's come in under budget, nearly $2 million. And what that PFM report has allowed for us to do, and I think this is what it's been for me at least, is to understand where we are now at this last budget with $1.2 million or billion that we put into the pension plans. What PFM report has shown us is that in order to actually get us to a point to where that we're fully funded, to where these retirees and current workers that are currently working for state government, and whether they're a teacher or a state police officer or whether they're a county road official, is making sure that whenever they retire that they actually have a check. And so what PFM was able to do was show us that basically funding is the issue. And from that funding, what we're going to have to do is find basically another $1.3 billion to $1 billion in this next budget to adequately fund these systems the right way, whether it be through the level dollar formula that we've seen out of PFM, which I think a lot of people have favorability of implementing, or through the assumptions, the accurate assumptions that we truly need for these systems under the market returns and what we're actually seeing coming out of the stock market and the investments that these systems have put in place. And so what PFM has done is shown us the funding part that we actually need. Then what they showed us was where are some of the cuts that can be made to benefits. And some of those cuts were very harsh. Some of those things are things that won't even get a start in the conversation.
Let's go there, you know, because as they say, the devil is in the details in politics and so many things. House Speaker Jeff Hoover seems to be ruling out the proposed clawback of the cost of living raises given to retirees over the last 20 years or so. Is that off the table?
You know, I think that is about the closest thing to being off the table as anything could be. I mean, what we're talking about with these clawbacks of these COLAs is an average of 25% for current retirees, and at the maximum for someone who retired before 1992, 38% of someone's check currently. We're talking about 75, 80-year-old men and women out in this state who are already having trouble paying for their prescription medication, buying food every week on fixed incomes. And they're talking, or that report showed that those COLAs could be clawed back up to 25% of their check, and that would be devastating to them. And so I don't think there is anyone that I've talked to that has a moral clarity of wanting to actually do that, that we've been in these conversations with. And so I think that that is as close of something being off the table as it can be.
It'd be about $400 million
yes, sir.
that would save if that did happen.
Yes.
You say it's not going to happen.
I think that it's highly unlikely that it's not. I don't want to say anything with a definite yet because we're still in talks trying to put this plan together, working nearly daily. We have another meeting today on Friday. And so, but that is as close of an issue in the PFM report that is off the table as it can be. And I think it's pretty safe that if there is a state retiree that's out in the audience, they don't need to worry anymore about their pension check being clawed back through these COLAs.
Would it be political suicide otherwise?
You know, I don't think that we're really looking at the political suicide part of this or going on these missions of political parity, but what we're trying to do is do what's right. And to these retirees that are out there right now with 38% of their check being looked at as being gone through the clawbacks, I don't think there's anyone that I've talked to that has a moral clarity of that being the right thing to do. And so irregardless of politics, irregardless of whether or not a representative votes for this and has a fear of coming back or not, that's just not the right thing to do in my opinion, and I won't be supporting that issue.
All right, one of the other proposals, state employees working longer, to 65 in most cases, to 60 for law enforcement. Do you see that as likely getting through?
You know, that has been something that's been able to start a lot of good conversations, and at the very least, it has been able to bring some type of conversation in these local communities with our law enforcement officers and our teachers and other state employees that has been able to bring some kind of understanding for those of us that are not in that. I think including the governor and all of the rest of our leadership, I've gotten at least 250 emails from teachers in my district explaining to me very emotionally their personal experience with what they do on a daily basis, why it's difficult for someone who's 65 years old to get up and down on the floor with a kindergartner. And you know, what we've come, or not what we've come to realize, what I knew and a lot of people knew, some have come to realize, is that these professions are some that are extremely important in these rural communities. And you're talking about some teachers that have students coming into their classroom where it may be the only hug that that kid gets during the day, the only positive interaction that they have with an adult during the day. And you have teachers that come into those classrooms on a daily basis to make sure that they have a consistent educational attainment for those students. And you know, the conversation on raising the age and retirements and the other things that we've talked about are definitely conversations that we have to see if we're making sure that we're doing right by all of Kentuckians, including our retirees. But I think that those talks are still ongoing.
When you talk about potential sources of revenue, the governor apparently is ruling out two of those this week in a radio interview. Extra revenue that might come from expanded gambling or legalization of marijuana. If the state needs an extra billion or so a year for pensions, where will that come from?
You know, there's a couple of things that we can do. What you're seeing now with the PFM report is one of those things of being cutting benefits. And I think that what we have to do in the legislature through this process is to understand that we have legal obligations. We have moral obligations to these retirees, to these current workers that are in place. And so I think what you'll see come out of this special session is something that puts that in perspective for all of Kentucky, but also honors our taxpayers that are paying for these things as well, including the teachers and police officers that are taxpayers also. And so the special session, it's yet to be determined exactly what's going to happen there. But the other two ways that we can find the revenues in order to make sure that we're fully funding these things is through budget cuts during this next budget cycle, and also through trying to raise revenues through tax reform. And I think that if you ask 100 different people what tax reform is, you'll get 100 different answers. For me, what that means is lowering the rate and broadening the base across the state of Kentucky, whether it's through lowering the income tax and broadening you know, the sales tax, or whether it's lowering the rate on sales tax and broadening you know, the base that we have and getting rid of the income tax. I think what I would like to see is a tax revenue economy in the state of Kentucky that is very conducive to economic growth and business in this state, to where that we can, instead of having to give out big incentive packages to businesses to come in, that they automatically look at Kentucky and say, hey, we want to be there because they're doing it right.
These retirement funds are all, you know, there are various funds, and the local governments are part of one that is in an awful mess apparently as well, and it's going to, a bill potentially be sent to some of them that some mayors are saying they may have to do layoffs in their city governments. All of them except the legislative pensions, which happens to be funded quite well.
Well, and on that, I would just like to make sure that that the listener or that the viewers of the show understand that the legislative pension system is at 79% funding, which is the #1 funded pension system in the state. But when we did reforms in 2013, which was my first session being there, we didn't exempt the reforms on the legislative branch. We made the same reforms across the board to the legislative issues. And so there's not a representative that's come to Frankfort since 2014 that's not been in the Tier 3 cash hazard balance the same way as any other state employee that's come in. And I think that it's a pretty safe guarantee to make that whatever we do in pension reform this year, that we're not going to hold ourselves harmless. We're going to make sure that we do at least the minimum of what we're doing to these other systems and the reforms. And what we've done in the past is we've put transparency into this, into the legislative systems. You can go online right now and you can find what any legislator's estimated pension is. And you know, the news stories they gather, the Harry Marbuleys of the world who are making $154,000 in pension returns, and they kind of grab onto that. But there's not a single legislator in Frankfort that's currently there that's looking at a salary that's going to get them to that point. It's always the next move, going into an executive branch position or going into a university or something else that they've done. Legislators' salaries between $35,000 and $45,000. It's nothing miraculous, but it's a good income to come up and do the work for the people of Kentucky. And so nobody's getting rich in the legislature off of these pensions.
If these local governments are to come up with a lot more money to pay their share of the retirements, I mean, are they going to get hit with this bill all at once?
Well, they'll get hit the same as we will. And so I think that, you know, the conversation on this needs to be redirected from the hit that we're getting to our budget to the obligation that we have to these workers into our state. And so when you're looking at why the state is going to have to put in another $1 billion to $1.3 billion is because our credit rating's been downgraded. It costs more money to be able to operate state government now because of that. We're in dire straits in the state of Kentucky of being a pay-as-you-go system in KERS. And so we have to make sure that we're living up to our obligations to these systems so that we can get our fiscal house back in order, and the county governments do as well. In 2000, CERS, which is the county retirement system, was at 160% funding, nearly 160% funding. In 16 years, in 2016, last year, the last reported assumption rate that they were at was 60%. They've lost 100% of their funding. And they've not missed the payments. They've not undercut the systems the way that these other ones have been in the past budgets that the legislature has passed because of misinformation. And so I think that what that shows us is that these defined benefit plans have a flaw in them.
We're with the House Majority Leader Jonathan Schell on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. More questions for him and more coming up in just a moment. Welcome back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. We're visiting with the Kentucky House Majority Leader Jonathan Schell. He is a Republican who represents, he's out of Lancaster, but you represent part of Madison and Gerald and Rockcastle, so
yes,
right in the sort of the agriculture belt there.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
All right. You know, we've been talking about this pension problem. It's huge. Everybody knows it. It's daunting. And then you come to ways to how do you save money, and you start cutting into state government, the operational budget, which some say is already so lean that we're going backward. As you look for ways to save, I mean, somebody is proposing, let's have smooth license plates instead of raised ones. I mean, do things like that add up enough?
You know, I think any time that we can cut waste and abuse out of government, I think that we definitely need to. One of the areas that myself and several of our members in the House are definitely looking at trying to cut waste and abuse is in our welfare system. You know, what we need to get to in the state of Kentucky is making sure that we're honoring people who are going to work every day and not embarrassing them or talking down to them at any point in time. But we need to really motivate people who are not working in our state to get back to work, to get them that dignity back of going and getting their hands dirty and actually having self-value and worth back in their life.
Does the state have some responsibility to get them trained? I mean, one of the things you hear, and you hear even in the cities, that there are all these jobs that are available in Louisville and Northern Kentucky, and people don't have the skills that are needed.
Yeah, and I think the last time that you and I talked, Bill, we talked about all these major accomplishments that we had during this session with the right to work legislation and the repeal of prevailing wage and all the jobs that have been created. Since that time, we've had nearly $8 billion in new investment come into the state, which is a record, and we're already at 7 months, and we've got still a lot of this year to go. We have 97,000 new people into the workforce today than we did a year ago through workforce participation rate. And we've created or helped create an environment for job creators to create nearly 15,000 new jobs in this state. And so what we have is we've got to look for the next step. You know, what's next? How do we make sure that we're getting the migration into the state to fill those jobs? How do we make sure that we're getting people who are on welfare, who are not working, back to work? Do we need a skills training session? Do we need to just start incentivizing them with the stick instead of the carrot to get off the couch and get back to work? And so we've got to look at all of these things to make sure that our employers have the work base that they need.
And then we have more Kentuckians in prison. As a rate, it's more than 40 other states than the national average. And so we're paying a lot for incarceration here. And the Justice Secretary, John Tilley, is talking about ways to try to lower those numbers while still holding offenders accountable. Yeah. Do you see anything there that would work?
Yeah, that's absolutely a very difficult balancing act. Because when you're looking at everyday Kentuckians that are out there, they want to make sure that law and order is kept in this state. They want to make sure that we're making sure that the people who are breaking our laws are being punished for that. And I think that whenever you're talking to an average Kentuckian about being soft on crime or taking away different things, it's a very difficult conversation for them to grasp and to actually stomach, and a lot of times it is for me as well. When you're talking about taking the theft rate from $500 to $2,000, you can get away in somebody's garage with a lot of stuff for $2,000 without getting a felony. And so I think that it's definitely a tough balancing act, but we also have to make sure that we're doing the right thing. I mean, these jails are truly overcrowded. In Madison County, they keep over 100 people overcrowded in that jail. In Rockcastle County, it's the same way. Really, I think you're a benefit in a county now if you don't have a jail. It's gotten to that point. But I think we either need to do some kind of program to build more jails to put these things in place or find efficiencies in the system. But I don't think that we can, as a state, be able to reward people to just let them out of jail and not do anything to them whenever they break the law.
Hard skills are, of course, the things that the skills you've acquired that you can do on a job and so forth. But you also talk about essential skills,
Yes,
what
sir.
have been called soft skills, that people can pass drug screenings and then show up to work on time, that they can literally know how to work.
Yeah.
And that's a bill that you tried last time. You're going to bring it back.
Yes, sir. It was House Bill 454 last year, if any of the viewers want to go look in that. But I think that it's pretty safe to say that if you're an employer out there and you're watching this program, you have a problem with a couple of different things whenever you're looking at employing someone right out of high school or right out of college. Is if you can get them to pass a drug test, which is difficult a lot of times. An employer in Gerald County, Alice Abrasives, 3 years ago told me that they interviewed 212 people in order to fill 11 positions. And they had nearly every one of those people that filed to fail that drug test to get that job. And so just making sure that people understand that, you know, passing a drug test is essential to getting a job in the state of Kentucky. Making sure that they show up to work, and then they show up to work on time. And making sure that they work well with others, that they listen and take instruction. And these are very simple things that you and I, when we were going through school, when we were had our parents at home, that they taught us that. But those are things that are being lost today on kids. As much as our teachers are putting curriculum and instruction into their heads, we need to make sure that we're making them ready for the workforce as well.
A quick answer on this, if you will. An adoption working group is coming up with some recommendations, and you expect a bill on that.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the most important pieces of legislation that we will pass during my tenure in Frankfort, to make sure that when a kid in the state of Kentucky needs a loving home, that they can get into one. And our caucus chairman, David Meade, is definitely a champion on this. He is one of the greatest people that I know. He has a heart for this, and he's going to make sure that whenever we get done in the state of Kentucky, working with Dan Dumas, the governor's czar on adoption and foster care, and working with the First Lady, Glenna Bevan, that we are the best state in the nation.
The House Majority Leader, Jonathan Gerald, thanks for coming.
Thank you,
appreciate it. Always appreciate you updating us. And coming next, a timely discussion on Kentucky Newsmakers about race relations in our Commonwealth. Bill Goodman and Gerald Smith join me next on Kentucky Newsmakers. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers on WKYT. Race relations have been complicated in Kentucky's 225-year history. A border state in the Civil War, Kentucky was home to abolitionists, slave traders, Union and Confederate soldiers. The debates are different now, but still framed in history and different perspectives. And Kentucky Humanities, with the support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, will be hosting a community conversation about stereotypes in race relations Thursday, September 21st. Aunt Jemima and the Complexities of Race will take place at 6:30 that evening at the Lyric Theater. Bill Goodman of the Humanities Council and Dr. Gerald Smith, who is a professor of African American Studies at the University of Kentucky, are joining me to talk about this. Thanks, gentlemen, for coming. We really appreciate it. That's an attention-getting title, Bill. What is this discussion about?
It's going to be about the complexities of race, and we're going to begin with Aunt Jemima, one of our new Chautauqua actors, who will present a brief stage presentation that evening at the Lyric Theater, which sort of establishes the conversation we'll have with our panel. The panel of distinguished members includes Dr. Smith from the University of Kentucky, Dr. Kelly Madison from Cal State in Los Angeles, Ricardo Nazario E. Colon, Chief Diversity Officer at Western Carolina University, John Schrader, a Lexington lawyer and a former family court judge. It'll be moderated by our friend and colleague, KET's Renee Shaw. We want to expose and, if we can, during our conversation, shatter some of the stereotypes that we all are too familiar with in Kentucky and in America, and have a community conversation about what should be done next to really talk about race relations in Kentucky.
The importance, Dr. Smith, of having a conversation like this.
Well, I think it's important for a number of reasons. One, because where our nation is, we see the polarization along the lines of race in this country at this time. At the same time, we're also seeing an increase in diversity in America. And of course, not only increase in diversity, but at the same time, you're seeing an increase in the number of hate groups. And so where are we? And this is something that Kentuckians do not talk enough about, is in terms of race. You know, we've had this benign historical narrative image of race in Kentucky, that slavery was mild, that segregation was not as deeply rooted, that this is a place where everybody gets along. But because of what's happening in our nation and what we know of what's really happening in our communities, this is something that we must discuss.
The choice of the use of Aunt Jemima is intentional. Right?
It is, Bill. Aunt Jemima was a caricature of an African-American house servant that was chosen by now the Quaker Oats Company to represent someone who works in the kitchen and doesn't do anything and know anything but make pancakes all day long. And she was featured and was quite successful at that venture. But then she went on as a very prominent African-American woman in Chicago. She had a great deal of wealth. She reached out and helped the underserved. She did some good things in her life. So it's the transition of a person who was a stereotypical actress, if you will, portraying a figure that went on to make something of her life.
Dr. Smith, does the public monument debate that is going on in this country, in Lexington and in Kentucky right now as well, does it makes it more timely for this discussion? Does it make it more important as well?
Yeah, it gives us an opportunity to sort of address hidden myths in Kentucky history on the one hand, but also just the role of power and control that whites have had in this state for so many years, determining what monuments are going to be erected, who's going to be celebrated, who's in, who's out, you know, defining the racial markers that describe our society, that whites are beautiful, good, pure, innocent, intellectual, that African Americans, you know, are bad, guilty, inferior. And so when you think about the monuments that were erected, they were erected with the purpose of perpetuating certain myths and stereotypes about African Americans. They also created a public memory in our society, a memory which excluded African Americans at the expense and the advantage of whites.
When you try to look forward and try to look at improved relations, how important is it that is it important to come to some commonality on the past, or do you just move ahead? Well,
you know, we cannot just move ahead. I mean, that's the problem, is that we need to have this conversation about race. It's as though we are constantly reintroducing the possibility of a conversation about race without necessarily having that conversation. You can go back to the 1990s after the O.J. Simpson trial and Rodney King's beating in 1992. There was discussions about we need a conversation about race. With the election of President Barack Obama, we need a conversation about race, because we're at a point in our society now where people are considering their racial identity, looking at racial categorizations, thinking about what they want to be called. So that's where we get into the complexities of race, you know, with filling out census forms and that sort of thing. And so what is the origins of all of that? And one of the things that is very clear is that whites have always set and defined the racial markers in terms of what we want to be called. But now you cannot assume who a person is or what they want to be called based on what you simply see.
The Humanities Council wouldn't be doing this if you didn't think it was important, Bill. What do you hope that people will take away from this conversation, and how they will leave that particular forum and go forth?
Bill, one of the things that Kentucky Humanities can bring to the table in this state is to act as a convener, to act as a body that brings people together for these discussions. And I think, as I've discussed with Dr. Smith, we need to talk about these issues and not look the other way. Nikki Finney, who was at the University of Kentucky for 21 years, teacher of creative writing and poetry, is now at the University of South Carolina, just recently said She grew up in the 60s and 70s in a dangerous time, and someone asked her how she compares those times with today, and she says dangerous times 10. That a lot of people are still anxious about the environment that we find ourselves in with the monuments and many other areas of society. Kentucky Humanities can bring people together to talk about these issues and to really support a conversation that will hopefully not always have the answers, but at least get people talking.
You invite certainly everyone to be at that event that evening.
Oh, sure. Churches, schools, organizations, as many as possible. Hopefully we'll have a very diverse audience in attendance to ask some very frank questions, you know, in a very civil environment. This is about education, essentially, in terms of us continuing to try to get to know one another.
Bill, it's open to the public, of course, and we want the public's participation. The panel will begin the discussion, but we're going to allow the community, the audience to participate too.
Well, I have that information for you. Again, the event is coming up on September 21st. It'll be at 6:30 that evening at the Lyric Theater, and again, open to the public. Gentlemen, thank you. We appreciate it very much for coming by. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Kentucky Newsmakers. I'll see you bright and early this week on WKYT This Morning. We begin at 4:30, and we hope you make it a good week ahead.